Battlefields are the final resting place for thousands of unknown soldiers, both nobles and commoners, whose lives were sacrificed in making of the history of the country. These historic assets are an intrinsic part of a nation's identity and consciousness. They inspire strong emotions and live on in stories, poetry and music. However, the history relating to them is often hard to unravel, as there is often little to see above ground and the historical record is usually written by the victors. The UK has many historic battlefield sites, some of which have legal protection through heritage protection legislation, whilst others are protected through landscape legislation. More recently, some archaeologists prefer the term site of conflict to battlefield, because of the difficulty in defining the geographical extent of a site. In England, the Register of Historic Battlefields lists the sites of 43 of the most important military battles on English soil. It is maintained by English Heritage. Historic Scotland is responsible for the inventory of historic battlefields. There are currently 17 battlefields on the inventory. In Wales, the Welsh ministers proposed in March 2011 that CADW also compiles a non-statutory register of historic battlefields. The consultation period ends on the 10th of June 2011. There is currently no battlefield register statutory protection for such sites in Northern Ireland. Legislation. The legislation to protect historic battlefields is relatively recent and arose following several key incidents involving important sites, e.g., the discovery in 1997 of an unprotected mass grave of soldiers who fought at the 1461 Battle of Towton and a large metal detector rally held on the battlefield of Marston Moor in 2003. Battlefield sites in England are material considerations in the planning process and are designated by English Heritage and put onto the Register of Historic Battlefields under powers conferred under the Historic Buildings and Ancient Monuments Act, 1983. This legislation did not confer a specific responsibility to create a register of battlefields, but a joint project between English Heritage, the National Army Museum and the Battlefields Trust in 1995 created the current register. In Scotland, the inventory of historic battlefields was introduced in 2009 and is complied by Historic Scotland on behalf of the Scottish ministers. This is done under the Historic Environment Act 2011, following on from the Scottish Historic Environment Policy with further guidance issued in March 2011. In England, submissions are considered by English Heritage's Battlefields Panel, which is a non-executive specialist panel which advises the organisation on policy and practice. Members include archaeologist Dr. Glenn Ford and Major General Julian Thompson CBOBE. Even though there is no legal requirement for English Heritage to be consulted over planning applications which affect registered battlefields, although they must be considered by the local planning authority, registration of battlefields means that any proposed development on the sites and the settings are material consideration under planning legislation. Planning Policy Statement 5. Planning for the historic environment states that there should be a presumption in favor of the conservation of designated historic assets, and that local authorities should assess whether an application for development outweighs the disbenefits. It also recognizes that there are many historic assets that are not currently designated, and that despite that, there should still be a presumption in favor of conservation such that substantial harm to or loss of the battlefield should be wholly exceptional. Some sites also receive protection under separate legislation. For example, the parts of the Battle of Maldon is part of the Coastal Protection Belt, a special landscape area and a site of special scientific interest. The Battle of Evesham site is subject to local planned policies which constrain development beyond its current extent. Legislation regarding metal detecting and the Portable Antiquities Scheme also applies to historic battlefield sites across the UK. However, because there is often little to see above ground, sites are regularly threatened by new road and residential development. The 2010 Heritage at Risk survey identifies several sites that are at risk, including the site of the Battle of Newburnford, which has been subject to piecemeal, peripheral development, and much of the site of the Battle of Stamford Bridge lies under modern development. War cemeteries are designated separately. Criteria for designation. Although there are many historic battlefields in England, only a few are considered to be important enough to be included in the register. The current criteria for designation are: historic significance. The battle must have had a significant impact on English history. It must have involved recognized military units, and the area on which the forces formed up and fought must be capable of definition on the ground. Surviving topographical and built features which played a part in the battle are important, as is the potential for battlefield archaeology, i.e., the survival of features and items from the battle such as graves and weapons, documents and memorials that help with the understanding of the battle through eyewitness accounts. A subsequent investigation will also raise the site's significance. In Scotland, the criteria are similar, but with the additional requirement that it must be possible to define the site on a modern map with a reasonable degree of accuracy. English Heritage is currently reviewing the criteria in the light of recent battlefield studies and developments in battlefield archaeology. Unlike listed buildings, registered battlefields in England are not graded according to the relative significance. This is also something that is under consideration. Identification of battlefields. Application online using a form on the English Heritage website or by contacting Historic Scotland. An initial assessment is carried out by English Heritage or Historic Scotland to find out if it meets the designation criteria. If it does, the owner and local planning authority is told about the application. Further research is carried out on the history and description of the site and put into an initial report in consultation with the owner, local planning authority, the battlefield's trust and applicant. All the information and representations are considered, and English Heritage or Historic Scotland makes a decision. List of historic battlefields. The UK Battlefields Trust claims that there are more than 500 historic battlefields and other fields of conflict in England up to the Jacobite risings of the 18th century. It is gradually compiling a UK Fields of Conflict database in collaboration with Historic Scotland, Leeds University, and English Heritage. The English Heritage Register of Historic Battlefields identifies 43 English battlefields, whilst Historic Scotland has 17 sites on its inventory. The purpose of both the register and inventory is to offer them protection and to promote a better understanding of the significance, the location, brief historic details and designation for each register battlefield in England can searched using the National Heritage List for England. There are also details of sources, history and archaeological excavations for each site where available on the English Heritage website. Scottish historic battlefields can be searched online using PASTMAP. English historic battlefields. Scottish historic battlefields.